There are places in the world where silence feels heavier than stone, where even the wind seems to hesitate, afraid to disturb what time has chosen to forget. The Valley of Qumran is one such place. Pale limestone cliffs rising over a sea of salt, the air sharp with minerals and memory. The ground is cracked and colorless, every breath dry as parchment. At dusk, the desert turns to gold, and shadows stretch like long-forgotten prayers across the sand. It is here, near the edge of the Dead Sea, that a small cave opens its mouth to the wind, no larger than a cell, no deeper than a whisper. Inside, a man kneels. His lamp flickers. The flame is small, trembling, as if conscious of where it burns. The archaeologist's brush moves slowly over the earth, grain by grain, until something resists, a curve beneath the dust. He exhales softly, and the air carries centuries away. Beneath his fingers, a fragment emerges. A thin scrap of parchment, curled and fragile, as though it has been waiting for this single moment of light. The letters on it are faint, almost erased, yet the ink catches the glow of the candle in a strange way. Not black, but bronze, breathing like embers. He leans closer. The words are not like any he has seen in the familiar scrolls, not law, not psalm. The line he can just make out reads, "The kingdom is not above nor below. It breathes where you breathe." He feels a chill. Outside, the desert holds still. This is the land where the Dead Sea Scrolls were born, the heart of an ancient brotherhood, the Essenes, who sought purity through silence. Their lives were a ritual of waiting. They bathed in cold water before dawn, copied scriptures with trembling hands, and buried their words in jars to protect them from the fire of empire. It was here, in these caves, that fragments of the book of Isaiah were hidden, along with hymns, rules, and strange poems written in Aramaic. But this piece, this small, breath-written line, appears in no record, no museum catalog, no translation. When the first scrolls were found in 1947, it was by accident, Bedouin shepherd boys tossing stones into a cave, hearing the shatter of clay instead of the echo of rock. Inside were jars sealed for 2 millennia, containing parchment older than memory. But the fragment now in this archaeologist's hand was discovered decades later, in a small hollow missed by the earlier expeditions. The name of the man who found it, Elias Corvin, appears only in a few brief reports archived in Jerusalem. His notes end abruptly. He wrote that the fragment seemed to resist being read, that it breathed, the way something alive does when touched. He described working by candlelight as a kind of prayer, his pulse slowing, his movements becoming ritual. He wrote that sometimes, as he uncovered a line of text, he thought he heard footsteps beyond the cave mouth, though no one was there. And one entry, scrawled in his field notebook, reads only, "These are not instructions. They are remembrance." No one knows why Corvin left Qumran a week later. His belongings were found neatly packed, his tent folded, his maps rolled and tied with linen string. He was never seen again in the region. Rousseau returns months later, alone. She brings with her a copy of the Gospel of Mary and a recording device. She sets the mirror upright upon a flat stone and begins to read aloud, "Where the mind is, there is the treasure. Do not look outward, but inward, into the quiet that remembers." Her voice echoes softly, breaking upon the walls. She writes later that when she paused between verses, the sound continued faintly, as if repeated by another breath. She leaves the cave after sunset, the mirror still standing in the dark. When she returns at dawn, dew has formed upon its surface, a thin film of water catching the first light. The reflection is no longer bronze but gold. Scientific explanation: condensation and refraction, amplified by mineral salts in the air. Yet something about it defies dismissal. She takes a single photograph, a blurred circle of light within darkness, and files it in the archive with the label, "Unverified, possible reflection of lantern or sunrise." But in her private notebook, she writes a different line. "Some mirrors remember what eyes forget." Centuries separate the woman who may have once held this mirror and the scholar who now guards it. Yet both stand before the same question: what do we see when we look into light that looks back? Perhaps the mirror was not meant to reflect the world, but to reveal the invisible space between the seen and the seeing, where prayer becomes perception and remembrance becomes vision. Even now, in the museum's climate chamber, the mirror rests behind glass. Visitors lean in to see themselves, but the reflection is faint, blurred, almost tender. Only the glow of their faces appears, mingled with the shimmer of ancient bronze. If you linger long enough, the light shifts. The reflection softens until it no longer resembles a face at all. Only brightness, diffused and breathing, like dawn seen through tears. The fragment was later examined under ultraviolet light at the Rockefeller Museum. Scientists noted something unusual: faint impressions beside the letters, like outlines drawn in dust. They formed a spiral, beginning at the corner of the parchment and widening outward until it disappeared into nothing. Some said it was the trace of the scribe's hand. Others thought it intentional, a symbol. In some Essene texts, the spiral represented the breath, the rhythm between the mortal and the eternal. And perhaps that is all it was ever meant to be. Not an image of a woman, but of what she remembered. A quiet proof that divinity still bends toward those who look inward, and that memory, like light, is never truly lost. In the monastic libraries of Mount Athos, the air smells of wax and vellum, of centuries folded into silence. Monks still copy texts by hand there, dipping quills into ink blacker than sleep. But among the thousands of manuscripts catalogued in the late 19th century, one fragment drew particular curiosity, a scroll unlike any other, written in Greek uncials but structured as a riddle. It was first found in 1887 by a visiting Russian scholar, Father Alexei Petrovich, in the library of the monastery of Simonopatra. The scroll had been sealed inside a wooden chest marked simply with the symbol of a circle divided by 7 lines. Its parchment, when unrolled, released a faint scent of cedar and oil, the ancient method of preservation used in Judea and Egypt. Its script was uneven, as if copied in haste, but its words glowed faintly beneath the lamplight, traced in iron gall ink tinged with crushed lapis. The first line read, "He who enters through one door finds another." No one knew what the 7 doors referred to. Some believed it to be an allegory, a mystical map of contemplation. Others, particularly the archivists who later examined its linguistic features, suspected it to be a later Byzantine copy of a far older text, perhaps from the first centuries of the desert monastic movement. Carbon dating would later confirm that the parchment itself dated to the early 6th century CE, though the language carried Semitic echoes far older. The scroll was titled Pi Lambda Alpha Iota Tau Omicron Phi Omega Tau, the Gates of Light. Each section was separated by a small painted symbol: a spiral, a flame, a cup, a ladder, an eye, a star, and finally, a single blank space. 7 images, 7 doors. Scholars tried to date the ink, but the result was inconclusive. The iron oxide had bonded with mineral grains, making the lines appear as if written directly into the dust itself. One curator whispered, almost amused, that perhaps the scribe had mixed sand into his ink, so that the earth would speak as the words did. The writing within was neither scripture nor sermon, but something in between, poetic meditations written in the voice of a solitary traveler wandering through chambers of increasing stillness. The first door spoke of the awakening of the senses, the second of the silence of thought, the third of the heart learning to mirror light. The 7th was never written. The parchment ends mid-sentence, as though the author had stopped while writing, or vanished before completion. The monks of Simonopatra kept the scroll secret for nearly a century, believing it contained esoteric teachings forbidden by early councils. It was only after the restoration work of 1972 that the document came under the care of the Greek Archaeological Service. Today, it resides in a humidity-controlled chamber in Thessaloniki, catalogued, translated, but never displayed. The mystery deepened when a similar pattern of 7 doors appeared carved into the ruins of an early monastic site in the Judean desert. In 1999, archaeologist Miriam Costa led a team excavating the foundations of a hermit's cell near Qasr el-Yahud, the site traditionally associated with the baptism of Christ. In the eastern wall, behind layers of limestone, they uncovered 7 niches, arranged vertically like steps. Inside the lowest one lay the remains of a small wooden tablet coated with wax, the kind used for temporary notes. When infrared photography revealed faint impressions, scholars identified the same sequence of symbols that appeared on the Mount Athos scroll: spiral, flame, cup, ladder, eye, star. The seventh, again, was empty. Costa noted in her field diary that this alignment felt less like architecture and more like liturgy carved into stone. An inscription nearby, half erased, bore the Coptic phrase Emna Peketh. Within the silence, whether the Athos manuscript and the Judean carving shared a common origin is uncertain. The timelines overlap only faintly, but there is evidence that early Christian mystics, including followers of the Desert Fathers and semi-Gnostic sects such as the Therapeuti of Egypt, preserved teachings centered on doors of inner revelation. The anonymous text known as the Book of Seven Steps from the Nag Hammadi corpus and fragments of Origen's lost writings both refer to initiations involving silence, breath, and vision. Some scholars speculate that the Scroll of the Seven Doors may have been a synthesis of these, a bridge between early ascetic philosophy and the later Hesychast tradition that flourished on Mount Athos. The vocabulary of the text, when translated, alternates between theological and deeply human. The first door is sound, where one learns to listen. The second is silence, where one forgets what one has heard. The third is light, seen not with the eyes but with the breath. Those who have seen the fragment describe it not as an artifact, but as an atmosphere. It is said to smell faintly of rain and salt. The letters, when photographed under magnification, seem to move slightly, not an illusion, but a shimmer caused by the uneven surface of the skin. The translation has never been officially published, but private transcripts circulate quietly among theologians and historians. The passages, though incomplete, carry the same rhythm, the same interior silence found in the Gnostic Gospels discovered in Nag Hammadi. Texts that spoke of divinity not as something worshipped, but remembered. The fourth is the heart remembering itself. The fifth is the world seen as a single breath. The sixth is the one who walks, seeing through all. The seventh, asterisk, and there the ink trails away. When Costa's team analyzed the pigments, they discovered traces of hematite and malachite, natural minerals often used by Egyptian scribes of the 1st century. The mixture suggests that the Athos version was a careful reproduction of a manuscript already ancient when it was copied. Dr. Nikos Varakis, a historian of early monasticism, has argued that the seven doors were not physical at all but symbolic stages of consciousness. He writes, "The missing seventh door represents what cannot be recorded, the silence at the end of knowledge, the threshold that cannot be crossed while still breathing. Yet for those who have stood within that Judean cave, the mystery feels less abstract. Visitors describe an atmosphere of unusual stillness. No sound of insects, no echo, only the steady pulse of their own heartbeat amplified by stone. When candles are lit within the seven niches, the light travels upward in slow succession, as if ascending through invisible air. It is said that monks from nearby Mar Saba Monastery once held night vigils there, each light representing a prayer of passage. In 2015, a photographic survey of the site revealed a previously unnoticed detail. Etched faintly above the final niche, almost invisible, a single line in Greek, Omicron Lambda Gamma Omicron, Pi Nu Omicron, not word, but breath. That phrase appears again centuries later in the Athos scroll. The light does not descend from heaven. One fragment reads, "It rises where the breath begins." Was it coincidence, a shared lineage, or the survival of a whisper passed through generations who chose silence over doctrine? When the Thessaloniki restoration team conducted high-resolution imaging of the parchment in 2019, they discovered an additional surprise: faint undertext beneath the visible script. The letters, written in Syriac, appear to be a palimpsest, an earlier manuscript overwritten but not entirely erased. The deciphered fragment reads, "In the chamber of the seventh door there is no door," a paradox perfectly circular, like the desert itself. Today, the scroll of the seven doors remains locked away, its translation incomplete. Few have seen it. Those who have described it less as an object and more as an atmosphere, a sense of descending inward, like walking into one's own pulse. Perhaps it was not a guide to mysticism at all, but a record of an experience so subtle it could only be hinted at in symbol. Perhaps the scribe never intended to finish it, because the seventh door cannot be entered, only remembered. If you stand before that last blank space on the parchment, the ink faded into nothing, you might feel the same soft pull the monks once felt. The urge to stop, to breathe, to listen for what isn't written. And in that moment, something within you, quiet, nameless, ancient, seems to open. A silence that feels like light. A door that was never closed. A memory that was never lost. In that small cave, centuries before empire and creed, someone must have written these words in the stillness of night. Perhaps he was an Essene scribe, alone after the others had gone to prayer. Perhaps he was afraid, not of Rome, but of the weight of what he was writing. Perhaps he knew that such words would not survive the temples or the councils that would come. So he wrote quickly, quietly, as if speaking to no one but the wind, then sealed his parchment in a clay jar and hid it beneath the earth, trusting the desert to guard it. The scroll remains unrolled beneath glass, its 7 symbols faintly gleaming in the lamplight of the archive. And somewhere, beyond language, beyond prayer, the 7th door waits, not to be entered, but to be found again. Inside the stillness that remembers, the wind never sleeps along the western desert of Egypt. It moves in long sighs across the dunes, brushing away one century to reveal another. Near the oasis of Bahariya, where the desert begins to rise into pale limestone ridges, a French-Egyptian expedition in 1998 uncovered what they first believed to be a cluster of catacombs. Instead, as they brushed away the sand, they found something far stranger. Rows of clay jars, sealed with wax and linen, stacked in careful patterns as though guarding a secret. There were over 400 of them. When the archaeologists lifted the lids, they expected bones or offerings. What they found were fragments of papyrus, each rolled tightly and wrapped in palm fiber. The ink had faded to the color of rust. Most disintegrated at a touch, yet a few, miraculously intact, revealed traces of Greek, Demotic Egyptian, and Coptic script, 3 languages whispering in a single breath. The site, carbon dated to the 4th century CE, lay along an ancient trade route once connecting the Nile Valley to the Libyan frontier. But nothing in its architecture fit the known pattern of tombs or monasteries. The chambers were small, square, and featureless, built not for the dead but for preservation. And maybe it did. It was not a burial ground. It was a library buried alive beneath the desert. The discovery echoed the story of Nag Hammadi, where in 1945 a farmer had found jars filled with Gnostic manuscripts hidden in a cliff near the Nile. But unlike those papyrus codices, this Bahariya cache was arranged as though meant to be sealed forever, not hidden in haste but buried in ceremony. Among the decipherable fragments was a recurring phrase, "The House of Silence remembers the word." The text bore resemblances to early monastic writings associated with the Kelia hermit settlements and the Pacomian communities, early Egyptian ascetics who built their monasteries like living labyrinths. Yet the tone of the Bahariya fragments was different. Where the monastic texts spoke of obedience and fasting, these spoke of memory, breath, and something the scribes called fas endin, the light within. It was archaeologist Dr. Layla Hassan, from Cairo University, who first noticed that the clay jars had been arranged in concentric circles, with one at the center marked by a painted symbol, a small open eye. When the surrounding sand was cleared, the pattern measured precisely 40 cubits across, the same diameter as the inner sanctum of the Temple of Thoth at Hermopolis. Hassan suggested that whoever buried this archive intended it as a sanctuary of knowledge, mirroring the cosmology of ancient Egypt, where writing itself was sacred, and each scroll a vessel of spirit. The mixture of Greek and Coptic phrases implied a transition between worlds, the dying age of temples and the birth of monasteries, the last voices of one faith becoming the first whispers of another. The most complete fragment recovered, now catalogued as Papyrus Bahariya 4 in the Egyptian Museum, contains a passage both fragile and luminous. There are words that cannot survive the air. so we placed them under the breath of the earth. Now, in the lamplight of the present, that same dust clings to the archaeologist's hands. The air in the cave grows warmer. The candle bends. Outside, the sky over Qumran is violet with the fading of day, the salt plains shining like glass. Somewhere, across the still water of the Dead Sea, lightning flickers in the clouds, the same silent flashes that once guided caravans through this ancient land. When the time of dust has ended, let those who listen in silence find them as the wind once found the sand. When scholars examined the ink under multispectral imaging, they found traces of copper oxide and indigo, the same pigments used in the oldest monastic scriptoriums of Wadi Nat Run. Some of the handwriting matched known samples from the Kelia community near modern Bahira, a sign that these scrolls may have been copied by monks fleeing persecution during the late reign of Emperor Theodosius I, when heretical texts were destroyed under imperial decree. It is known from Coptic chronicles that around 391 CE, following the closure of pagan temples and libraries, several groups of ascetics smuggled manuscripts into the desert to preserve them from burning. Many were never seen again. Hassan's team believed this buried circle of jars might be one of those lost refuges, the last resting place of an order who called themselves the Keepers of the Word beneath the wind. One jar, unopened during excavation due to its fragility, was later scanned using micro-CT imaging at the Louvre laboratories. Inside was a papyrus roll measuring nearly 2 meters long. Its title, written in gold dust, barely visible, Logoi tis Irenes, the words of peace. Its contents remain unknown. To unroll, it would destroy it. But even sealed, the scroll emits faint residues of frankincense and resin, the same materials used in early Christian liturgical rites. Dr. Hassan once described entering the chamber at dawn, before the equipment arrived. The sand had cooled overnight, and a thin mist hung where her breath met the morning light. She said it felt as if the desert itself were exhaling. The air inside was still, but not empty. A silence shaped, not void. She sat beside the central jar and could hear the soft settling of the dunes above, like the slow turning of pages. Later, in her notes, she wrote, "Perhaps these jars were not meant to be opened. Perhaps they were prayers, written for the future, entrusted to the earth itself." Over the following months, the team mapped the site and discovered 2 parallel corridors leading away from the main chamber. Both ended in walls carved with the same inscription, a single word in Greek, anamnesis, remembrance. He closes his notebook. He knows he should catalog the find, mark its coordinates, send for preservation tools. But instead, he sits in the stillness. He reads the line again. It breathes where you breathe. He feels the wind moving faintly through the cave's mouth. The flame wavers. In that moment, he cannot tell whether he is reading a text or being read by it. No tombs, no idols, only words, sleeping. The find transformed Bahariya from an obscure oasis to one of Egypt's most spiritually charged archaeological sites. Yet much remains sealed. The desert continues to guard its scripture, the sands swallowing the edges of the excavation each season. Satellite imagery has revealed traces of a larger complex beneath, rectangular foundations forming a cross within a circle, the same geometry found in late Hermetic texts describing the House of 7 Echoes, a symbolic temple representing the journey of divine knowledge through matter. Whether this structure ever existed or is merely metaphor remains uncertain. When the sun sets over Bahariya, the dunes burn gold, and the wind begins its long recitation. The archaeologists pack their tools, cover the site, and leave it to the silence again. And as night deepens, the sand settles once more, erasing footprints, returning everything to the stillness it remembers. Some say that on certain nights, when the wind changes, a low hum drifts from beneath the surface, the faint vibration of air moving through sealed jars. Scientists explain it as resonance, the sound of pressure shifting as temperature falls. But for those who have stood there in that hour, it feels different. It feels like the whisper of something waiting, not lost, only sleeping. Perhaps the library was never built for reading, but for listening. Perhaps it was meant to teach that knowledge, once buried, continues to breathe beneath the world, patient, unseen, enduring. And when the sand finally gives it back, the words may not speak of revelation or empire, but of something quieter, the faith of those who wrote so that silence might one day remember. Because beneath the desert, under the weight of forgotten suns, the words still lie unbroken. The desert outside sighs, a long, low sound, as if the landscape itself were exhaling after centuries of holding its breath. The archaeologist lowers the parchment back onto the sand. He covers it lightly, not to hide it, but to let it rest, each scroll holding its breath. And if you listen closely, when the wind moves across the dunes, you might hear the faint turning of a page, the desert itself remembering how to read. There are places where history feels half asleep, where time does not pass, but hums quietly beneath the surface. In the mountains of Cappadocia, central Anatolia, such places still breathe. The valleys are carved with openings that once led to sanctuaries, monasteries, and hermitages, whole worlds of devotion hidden within stone. The people who built them sought the silence of the earth, carving their prayers into tuff and twilight. The monastery of the Veiled Stars was one of these. Its name, Astrocalyptos, first appeared in the records of the Byzantine chronicler Michael Psellos around the 11th century. He spoke of a place of hollow light in the mountains, where monks sang without sound. For centuries, it was dismissed as legend, until the summer of 1989, when a team of Turkish archaeologists led by Dr. Yusuf Erkin discovered a sealed chamber beneath the cliffs near Guladir Valley, east of Gorim. The chamber, hidden behind a false wall, was carved directly into volcanic rock. When they entered, they found a narrow corridor that descended in a spiral, its walls covered in frescoes so faint they seemed woven from dust. The air was cold and dry, perfectly preserved. At the bottom stood a single apse, its dome still painted with a pattern of stars. But unlike any church ceiling known from the Byzantine period, the stars were covered by thin layers of mineral wash, deliberately veiled, their light muted. No icons of saints or Christ adorned the walls. Only geometric constellations, circles within circles, as if mapping not heaven, but the soul. Perhaps some truths are meant only to be found for a moment, seen once, then returned to the silence that formed them. On the floor lay a small clay lamp, unbroken. Inside it, residue of beeswax and frankincense still clung to the wick. Carbon dating placed it between the 9th and 10th centuries CE, the turbulent period of the Byzantine iconoclasm, when images were forbidden and monasteries often destroyed for their devotion to silence rather than dogma. Yet the site bore no marks of desecration. Instead, it seemed intentionally sealed. Behind the altar, the team found a stone chest, no larger than a child's cradle. Inside were 7 tablets of slate, engraved with lines in Greek and Syriac. The first tablet began with the phrase, "When the stars were veiled, we sang in the dark." The writing was devotional, not doctrinal, a meditation on divine absence, describing the practice of prayer beneath a night sky that could not be seen. One passage read, "The light of heaven blinds. We close our eyes to see the stars within. In silence, their music returns." The text seemed to blend Christian monasticism with a cosmology closer to Neoplatonic thought, where the divine is perceived not by vision but by inner reflection. A tradition rooted in the early mystics of Cappadocia, like Gregory of Nyssa, who wrote that God dwells in darkness beyond all light. Erkin's team noted that the geometric frescoes above the apse mirrored ancient star maps used by Hellenistic astronomer monks. The constellations of Lyra, Cygnus, and Aquila were faintly visible, aligned with the natural fissures in the rock ceiling, suggesting that the cave's architects designed it as both chapel and observatory. When the evening sun entered through a narrow shaft, beams of light struck specific stars on the ceiling, marking the solstices and equinoxes. It was a temple that prayed with the sky. In the valley, the wind begins again. Grains of sand lift and scatter, catching the last traces of the candle's glow. Each spark of dust turns briefly to gold before vanishing into the dusk. Fragments of parchment were found in a crevice near the altar, preserved under centuries of dust. One bore the name Athanasius of Caesarea, possibly a later scribe, with a phrase in Greek, "Every star is a psalm written in light." The ink contained traces of soot and silver nitrate, rare, expensive materials for a remote monastery, suggesting patronage by an elite circle of scholars or mystics. Nearby, in a second chamber, they discovered what may have been the monks' sleeping cells, hollow alcoves carved like the inside of a hive. Each contained a small groove where a lamp once burned. One alcove bore an inscription in faint red pigment. "Keep the flame as breath, not as fire." This mixture of astronomy, asceticism, and mysticism baffled the researchers. Erkin's later report, published in the Anatolian Archaeological Review, 1993, proposed that the monastery had served as a refuge for scholars fleeing Constantinople during the early 9th century, when theological debates over icons turned violent. The Cappadocian caves, remote and easily hidden, became sanctuaries for those seeking contemplation over controversy. The Astrocalyptos community, according to later oral traditions gathered from nearby villagers, practiced nocturnal prayers timed with the movement of constellations, watching the breath of the sky. As one 12th century Syriac manuscript puts it, they believed that each star was the reflection of a soul returning to its source. Their chants, recorded phonetically in the tablets, had no words, only vowel tones, e-o-u, sustained in rhythm with inhalation and exhalation. Acoustical analysis conducted during restoration in 2008 revealed that the dome amplifies sound in a curious way. Each tone echoes 7 times before fading completely. The researchers called it resonant silence, a structure literally built to breathe sound into stillness. Outside, the cliffs of Cappadocia rise like frozen waves. Inside, light and sound once moved in measured harmony, a celestial metronome marking prayers that were never written. The monastery's name, Veiled Stars, seems to have held double meaning. The literal stars above, hidden beneath mineral layers, and the stars within, the monks themselves, extinguished from the world yet still burning in secrecy. In 1990, a small gold pendant was found near the entrance, etched with both a cross and a 7-pointed star, a rare synthesis of Christian and cosmological symbols. The object is now housed in the Museum of Nevşehir. It is believed to have belonged to the abbot, perhaps the last custodian before the site was sealed. When Erkin returned to the monastery years later, he brought a portable telescope. At night, he climbed the ridge above the site. From there, the same constellations painted in the dome were visible, faint but unbroken, just as they had been 1,000 years before. He wrote in his field diary, "And if you were standing there, in that breathless hour between night and memory, you might feel something too. The faint pulse of a forgotten gospel, still written in the skin of the earth, still alive beneath the dust, waiting for another quiet heart to listen. The stars still remember. The veiling was never to hide them, only to teach that light is clearest when unseen." Today, the monastery of the Veiled Stars remains closed to the public, accessible only to researchers under strict conservation rules. The frescoes are too fragile, the chamber too delicate. But sometimes, in winter, when the wind sweeps down the valley, locals say they hear a low hum, a vibration that rises and falls like distant chanting. Perhaps it is only the wind moving through the fissures. Or perhaps the stars, long veiled, are still singing through stone. The caves of Cappadocia hold many such mysteries. Hidden libraries, hermit altars, half-vanished prayers. Yet few feel as alive as Astrocalyptos. It stands as a testament not to faith as dogma, but to faith as listening, to the belief that heaven is not above, but within, that silence can sing, and that even buried under centuries of dust and empire, a monastery carved from light can continue to breathe through the dark. And when the moon rises over Guludir Valley, casting its silver over the rocks, the stars appear again, faint, flickering, endless, as though the veil had never been drawn at all. There are ruins that do not rest on land but drift in silence beneath the tides. Off the coast of Israel, near the ancient harbor of Caesarea Maritima, lies a scatter of columns, amphorae, and eroded walls, relics from the Roman and early Byzantine eras, long swallowed by the sea. Divers call it the city that breathes underwater. But among the marble fragments and coral-covered stairways, one discovery changed how scholars spoke of the early church. a discovery that blurred the line between scripture and tide. It began in 1961, when underwater archaeologists led by Avner Rabin of the University of Haifa began mapping the sunken harbor built by Herod the Great. The port, once known as Sebastos, had collapsed centuries earlier under earthquakes and coastal subsidence. Amid the wreckage, the divers found a basalt chest wedged between fallen columns. When opened, it contained shards of limestone, fragments of glass, and a small lead cylinder sealed with resin. There are whispers beneath Alexandria, older than the streets that now sleep above them. Beneath the marble columns, under the ruins of the Serapeum and the fallen libraries, lie chambers carved into the living stone, catacombs of prayer, silence, and forgotten flame. In one of those chambers centuries ago, a song was once sung that could not be written. The walls still seem to remember it, even if no ear remains that can hear. Inside that cylinder was a scroll, or what remained of one, a papyrus hardened by salt and time. It took more than a decade before it could be unrolled in a controlled chamber. Under infrared imaging, words appeared, faint and sea-stained, written in Greek with traces of Coptic marginalia. The first readable line: "He spoke not to the crowd, but to the sea, and it answered." The find became known among researchers as the Gospel of the Silent Sea. Its existence was quietly catalogued in the 1970s by the Israel Department of Antiquities, though the text was too fragmentary to publish. Only portions survived, parables that seemed familiar yet altered, as though retold from another shore. One passage described a teacher walking along the water's edge at dawn, speaking not in commands, but in questions. He tells his disciples, "The waves do not listen for words, they listen for weight. The sea knows the heart more than the tongue." Another fragment, written in Coptic script, speaks of the mirror of the deep, where the face of heaven sleeps. Scholars hesitated to identify the author. Some proposed it was a poetic homily written by early Gnostic monks in the 3rd century, possibly a lost sermon from the Acts of Thomas tradition, known to circulate in the Levant. Others suggested it was a later Byzantine meditation influenced by desert mysticism, when silence itself was treated as sacred speech. What gave the discovery gravity was its context. The scroll had been sealed intentionally, not lost to the sea by accident. The lead cylinder bore an inscription etched faintly in Latin and Greek, "To the deep, for remembrance." It was said that the disciples of the hidden light gathered there, in secret, when the city trembled under the shifting winds of empire. Scholars, healers, exiles, and those who followed the teacher from Galilee who had spoken of an inner kingdom, all came carrying small lamps through tunnels perfumed with salt and oil. They were not heretics then, only seekers of something quieter than doctrine. Their hymn had no melody, only breath, a rhythm of inhalation and surrender. It began in silence and returned to it. It seemed to be a ritual deposition, a prayer consigned to the ocean, much like votive offerings once placed in temple wells. Nearby, divers found 3 amphorae arranged in a triangle, each containing small oil lamps and fish bones, perhaps symbolic remnants of early Christian liturgy. In 2003, a new expedition led by marine archaeologist Dr. Nirit Ben-David revisited the site using modern sonar mapping. Beneath silt layers, they uncovered part of a mosaic floor, its tesserae still faintly visible. It depicted a shoreline where waves merge into stars, with a Greek inscription curving around the edge, Thalassa ou Syopa. The sea is not silent. The artistry dated to the 5th century CE, when Caesarea's Christian community flourished before the Persian invasions. Ben-David's team found that the structure aligned precisely with the remains of a coastal chapel dedicated to Theophany, the feast of divine manifestation through water. The chapel's apse once opened directly onto the sea, so that during sunrise mass the tide would rise and retreat beneath the altar. Some scholars believe the submerged scroll was part of that same sanctuary, perhaps a liturgical text used during nocturnal vigils, when the monks would read psalms over the waves. Its fragments carry repeated invocations of light upon the deep and the kingdom reflected in water. The handwriting analysis revealed 2 different scribes, one Greek, one Coptic, both using carbon-based ink mixed with fine shell powder. The mixture suggests it was written near the coast, where limestone dust and salt air would blend naturally with ink. When the papyrus was examined under ultraviolet light, a second layer of writing was found, faint traces of musical notation, ekphonetic signs similar to those in early Byzantine chant manuscripts. The implication was astonishing. The gospel of the Silent Sea may have been sung, not read. A ritual meant for water, voice, and reflection. One section, reconstructed from fragments, reads, "Where the shore ends, the breath begins. He who listens to the tide hears the unspoken name." When archaeologists first opened the sealed catacombs near Qam el-Shokafa, they found remnants of altars, oil flasks, fragments of Coptic script that spoke not of conquest or resurrection, but of awakening. The carvings were strange. No crucifixions, no saints. Only eyes within circles of gold leaf, rays branching outward like veins of sunlight beneath stone. One inscription, carved faintly near the arch of a tomb, read in Greek, "Lux meminit lusum," the light remembers light. Every ripple is a word returning home. Ben David's expedition also recorded unusual acoustics in the submerged ruins. When sound is transmitted through the hollow columns and marble slabs, the vibrations produce harmonic frequencies, matching the musical intervals preserved in early Christian chant. It was as if the sea itself had become the choir. The locals of Caesarea still speak of that portion of the coast as Hanasia B'Yam, the church in the sea. Fishermen say that on calm nights, when the moonlight flattens the surface, one can hear tones rising from beneath the water. Long, vowel-like sounds that fade and return like breathing. Scientists attribute it to trapped air escaping from submerged stone cavities, but others prefer the older explanation: the sea remembering its prayers. In 2017, digital reconstruction techniques allowed researchers to simulate how the original chapel might have looked. The inner walls were likely painted with marine imagery, dolphins, fish, and ships, symbols of baptism and rebirth. The floor mosaics, based on recovered tesserae, shimmered between turquoise and gold, designed to resemble moving light under shallow water. When worshippers stood inside, it must have felt as though they were standing within the sea itself. The Gospel of the Silent Sea, now preserved in climate-controlled conditions at the Rockefeller Museum in Jerusalem, remains too fragile for display. But a high-resolution facsimile reveals the text's haunting rhythm. Half prayer, half tide. The deep speaks in sleep. Those who listen without asking hear the first word again. It is perhaps not a gospel in the canonical sense, but something more intimate, a meditation on creation, memory, and reflection, written by those who believed that silence was not emptiness, but the language of God. Dr. Ben David once said in an interview, "The team who entered in 1901 recorded the atmosphere as unlike any Christian or pagan site known, an air of ceremony without temple. A thin coating of soot on the ceiling suggested centuries of oil lamps, burned low and close to the rock. A few meters deeper, they uncovered a fresco depicting a figure holding no cross, no scroll, but a mirror of polished bronze. Its surface had been deliberately scratched out, as if the reflection itself had been forbidden. These were not heretics. They were listeners. They built a theology of echo, the belief that divinity returns in waves. When the divers ascend today, they do so through shafts of filtered light, carrying fragments of that echo back to the surface. Traces of ink that once drifted with the tide, words that still glimmer in salt. Perhaps the scroll was never meant to be read by human eyes again. Perhaps it was written for the sea, so that even when empires drowned, something would keep whispering beneath the waves. And as the sun sets over Caesarea, and the horizon dissolves into violet haze, the water turns to glass. For a moment, the sea becomes a mirror, reflecting not the sky, but the memory of a voice that spoke softly enough to be heard forever. There are moments when history seems to hold its breath, when what remains of the past is no longer stone or parchment, but ash. In 1949, in the aftermath of war, a team of Polish and Italian archaeologists entered the ruins of the monastery of St. Catherine, near the foot of Mount Sinai, to restore its damaged archives. What they found beneath a collapsed scriptorium would come to be known, quietly, as the hidden library of fire. The monastery itself, built in the 6th century under Emperor Justinian, had long been known as one of the oldest continuously inhabited Christian sanctuaries in the world. Its granite walls had resisted conquest, desert, and time. Yet, during a small electrical fire in the 1890s, a portion of its eastern annex was sealed off and forgotten. Decades later, post-war excavations uncovered a chamber blackened with soot, filled with the remains of charred manuscripts and fragments of parchment fused into lumps of carbon. The initial assumption was that the collection had been destroyed beyond recognition. But when restoration teams began separating the carbonized layers under a microscope, faint traces of lettering appeared: Syriac, Greek, Arabic, Coptic, and Aramaic. The ashes were not chaos. They were a library, burned but still whispering. It was Father Timotheos, a Coptic scholar assisting the restoration, who first noticed that some fragments shared identical phrasing with known Gnostic writings, but in reverse order. Where the canonical Gospel of John opens with, "In the beginning was the Word," one fragment began, "In the silence was the beginning." Over the next decade, teams from Rome and Cairo used infrared photography to reconstruct over 200 legible lines. The texts seemed to belong to an unknown compilation of early Christian mystic writings, possibly linked to the Syriac-speaking monks who once inhabited the Sinai hermitages between the 4th and 7th centuries. The deeper they moved, the stranger the silence became. Instruments measured no air currents, yet the candles swayed slightly toward the walls. When sound was made, even the click of a heel on the floor, it seemed to return softer, as though absorbed by something living. Among the ashes, archivists recovered a half-melted bronze seal stamped with the Greek phrase, Bibliothèque tu Cryptophotos, Library of Hidden Light. It was unlike any catalogued institution. Papyrological analysis dated the oldest texts to around the 5th century CE, with later copies extending into the 9th. Several bore marks of reuse, overwritten palimpsests on older scrolls once containing philosophical commentaries or pagan hymns. The ink, made from oak gall and soot, had survived precisely because the fire sealed the room from moisture. The destruction became preservation. One passage, translated from Syriac, reads, "When knowledge burned, it became invisible. When it became invisible, it became light. And the light hid itself within memory." The fragments revealed a community of scribes who saw transcription not merely as record-keeping but as a devotional act, the slow breathing of faith through ink. Their writing oscillated between theology and poetry, between scripture and dream. Many passages mirrored Platonic imagery, describing ascent through 7 chambers of reflection, an echo of monastic mysticism already found in Egyptian and Cappadocian texts. What made the discovery particularly haunting was its apparent organization. The ashes were layered in concentric circles, as if arranged deliberately before burning. Some scholars now believe that the monks, anticipating invasion or persecution, may have set the library aflame themselves, transforming it into a ritual of concealment. In 1952, archaeochemist Dr. Maria Garibaldi from the University of Bologna examined residue from the chamber's stone walls. She found traces of myrrh resin and bitumen, substances not typically used for book preservation, but for sacred embalming. It suggested that the manuscripts had been anointed before destruction. Among the fragments catalogued later at the Greco-Roman Museum was a thin strip of papyrus, almost illegible, but carrying a pattern of repeating syllables, perhaps the phonetic remnants of a chant. Linguists found resemblances to early Gnostic hymns attributed to the sects of Basilides and Valentinus, mystics of the 2nd century who believed light was not a substance, but a memory, the origin of all souls. A funerary ritual for knowledge. The accounts of early pilgrims, including Egeria, 4th century, and Cosmas Indicopleustes, 6th century, mention secret repositories at Sinai, rooms of silence where books sleep until the last light. The fragments from the hidden library seem to embody that prophecy. One of the most complete sections recovered, now displayed in the St. Catherine Museum, is known as the Hymn of the Ashes. Written in Greek and partially translated into Coptic on the reverse, it reads, "When the page turns to smoke, the words rise unbound. The fire remembers them, and carries them upward, where no hand can touch their meaning. The rhythm of the verses matches known Syriac hymn patterns used in 6th century monastic chants. It is possible that these lines were sung during the burning, a liturgy of transfiguration, not destruction. Further excavations uncovered remnants of iron stands arranged around a central stone platform, a configuration resembling a circular scriptorium. Each stand bore traces of melted glass and wax, consistent with lamp light. Charcoal analysis dated the fire to between 780 and 830 CE, a period of intense theological conflict following the iconoclastic controversy. Some records from the Byzantine archives in Constantinople refer to a sect of silent brethren in Sinai who turned their books to dust rather than to exile. One translated fragment reads, "In 1960, high-resolution X-ray photography revealed underlayers of writing that did not match any known language. The letters were geometric, formed of spirals and intersecting lines, perhaps symbolic rather than linguistic, a visual theology. The patterns bore resemblance to early desert Christian talismans meant to embody divine names without pronouncing them. When viewed under polarized light, these hidden inscriptions reflected faint gold, suggesting traces of metallic pigment. The scribes had written with literal light. Father Timotheos described the sensation of touching those fragments. They crumble like black snow, yet when you breathe near them, the ashes rise, as if remembering they were once words. Over time, the site became a pilgrimage for scholars rather than worshippers. In the dim, candlelit gallery where the ashes rest, visitors often describe the faint scent of resin and parchment, the silence of centuries compressed into one room. By 1998, digital reconstruction of ultraviolet scans revealed an astonishing detail. Fragments of a passage that referred to a book of breath written for the world when its memory grows thin. The translation remains incomplete, but the sense is unmistakable. The monks of Sinai believed knowledge itself was a living being, capable of sleep and resurrection. No definitive catalog of the hidden library has ever been completed. Many fragments remain in storage, sealed from light to prevent disintegration. Yet their words, scattered and reassembled, suggest an unbroken continuity between ancient mystery schools, desert monasticism, and the later mystic movements of the Eastern Church. Today, when researchers unseal the preservation chambers for inspection, they must wear oxygen masks. Not because the air is toxic, but because the ash is so fine it responds to breath. One exhalation can erase a line forever. Perhaps that is why the monks burned their books in the first place, to return the word to breath, to let it live as air rather than as ink. The ashes remain, a dark scripture that glows faintly under the right light. No one knows how many texts lie beneath, or whether the true catalog was ever written. But in the silence of the Sinai night, when the wind moves through the granite canyons, the sand sometimes carries a scent of smoke, faint, ancient, almost sweet. And those who have stood near the ruins at dawn say that when the sun touches the blackened stones, it looks as though the library is waking again. A low shimmer, a breath of gold dust rising from the ground. We are sparks fallen into the world of shadow, and we return through remembrance. Not destroyed, only transfigured, the word becoming light once more. There are legends that begin with sound, not a word or a cry, but a vibration so soft that time itself seems to listen. In the high plains of northern Armenia, among the basalt ridges near the ancient fortress of Lori Bird, shepherds still tell of a monastery whose bells rang even when no hands pulled their ropes. For centuries it was dismissed as folklore, a poetic superstition whispered by villagers when fog rolled through the valley. Yet, when archaeologists uncovered the monastery ruins in 1997, they discovered traces of something that made the legend harder to ignore. The monastery, known in medieval records as Serp Zerayan Vank, the Monastery of the Tree of Light, was built sometime between the 10th and 11th centuries, during the Bagratuni dynasty. It stood near a steep gorge cut by the Debd River, its basalt blocks blackened by rain and wind. The last historical mention of it comes from a 1252 manuscript preserved in Ekmidzin. The monks of Zerayan kept vigil by bells that answered the wind with prayer. When archaeologists from Yerevan University began excavating the site, they expected a standard monastic complex, refectory, chapel, bell tower. What they found, beneath collapsed masonry, was a circular tower unlike any known Armenian belfry. The walls were lined with vertical bronze tubes, each bearing faint inscriptions in classical Armenian and Greek. Embedded between them were cavities filled with small quartz stones and thin veins of oxidized copper. At first, these details seemed merely decorative. But as restoration began, engineers noticed something unusual. When the wind blew through the gorge at certain speeds, the structure emitted a low harmonic tone. The entire tower was, in essence, an acoustic instrument, a bell that did not need a clapper. Further analysis by acoustical archaeologist Dr. Armin Hakobian revealed that the internal design matched the harmonic proportions of medieval resonance theory described in manuscripts from the monastery of Hagpat, only 30 kilometers away. The monks of the region, it seemed, had studied not only theology but the physics of vibration, what they called zane, meaning both sound and voice. In 2001, restoration workers discovered fragments of an inscription on a stone lintel, reading, "He who listens through stone hears the prayer of air." The phrase echoed a line from the Book of Hours of Sanahin, 11th century, where sound is described as the bridge between earth and heaven. Among the artifacts recovered from the monastery were several bronze fragments believed to belong to the original bells, small, hollow spheres with fine perforations, designed to vibrate rather than ring. One still contained traces of beeswax and myrrh, possibly used for tuning resonance. Laboratory analysis confirmed the alloy was not standard bronze but a rare mixture containing tin, silver, and a minute concentration of lead, almost identical to that used in certain Byzantine singing bowls discovered in Cappadocia. It was not a faith of judgment, nor of punishment, but of recall. To remember light was to become it again. It was Dr. Hakobian who first proposed that Serp Zerayan functioned as both a place of worship and an acoustic experiment, a sanctuary where monks attempted to build sound. He cited a 12th century chronicle by the historian Samuel of Ani, which mentions a group of monastic scientists called the Zainavorner, those of the voice, who believed that sound could carry prayer directly into the fabric of creation. Excavations in the lower crypt uncovered a narrow chamber filled with clay tablets marked in an early form of Armenian musical notation, ka symbols, alongside diagrams of circles and intersecting lines. Some of these diagrams correspond to harmonic ratios of 1 to 2 to 3 to 4, consistent with Pythagorean theory. It appears that the monks of Zerayan studied the relationship between sacred chant and architectural vibration, tuning their stone walls like instruments. The floor of the main apse, when cleaned, revealed a circular mosaic of tesserae made from polished obsidian and limestone, depicting concentric waves radiating outward from a central point, a visual representation of resonance. But the mystery deepened when archaeologists reassembled portions of the bronze tubes from the tower and tested them under controlled wind conditions. When the air passed through at certain velocities, approximately equivalent to the mountain gusts measured in that region during autumn, the tubes emitted a chord, a low triad of C, E, and G. The sound was soft, almost imperceptible, like breath humming through a flute. Yet, when recorded and amplified, the tone matched the same pitch used in medieval Armenian liturgical chanting, known as Erkane Zain, the eternal tone. Local villagers recalled stories told by their grandparents. On nights of heavy fog, when no one stood near the monastery, a sound like distant singing rose from the valley. Shepherds claimed the earth itself seemed to hum. Scientists explained it as wind resonance in the gorge, but the coincidence with the tower's harmonics was uncanny. One of the last monks known to have lived at Zerayan was Vartan of Ani, a 13th century scribe who wrote treatises on sacred acoustics. His surviving text, The Song That Builds the World, preserved in a damaged manuscript at Matnadaran, describes bells that ring without hand, in which the voice of the unseen becomes prayer. It seems the monastery's purpose was not to summon the faithful, but to answer the air. In 2012, a joint Armenian-Italian team performed a ground-penetrating radar scan around the ruins. They found evidence of underground tunnels extending toward the riverbank. The channels, when mapped, corresponded exactly with the direction of prevailing wind currents. It appeared that the monks had engineered a natural wind organ, using the topography itself to sustain harmonic resonance across the complex. Archaeometallurgical analysis conducted by the Yerevan Institute of Technology revealed that the bronze tubes were cast with uneven wall thickness, intentionally designed to produce layered overtones. When one tube vibrated, it triggered sympathetic resonance in others, creating a cascading effect. The result was an architectural chorus, an invisible chant carried by the mountain wind. The voice that once led those secret gatherings, a woman named Thekla, according to later records, was said to have been a healer who had walked with the apostles, though never named among them. Her hymn was never written because she feared words could bind what was meant to move. Instead, she taught through vibration, low hums, slow breathing, the striking of bronze bowls whose sound lingered long after the air had stilled. The tradition endured for generations in whispers, moving from the catacombs to the monasteries of the Egyptian desert, where monks would hum through the night, believing each tone opened a gate between the seen and unseen. Today, at sunset, when the valley cools, visitors to the restored fragments of Serp Zerayan Vank sometimes hear a faint tone rising from the stones, a hum that fades as quickly as it begins. It is not loud. It does not echo. It only lingers long enough to make one wonder if sound can remember where it came from. To the villagers, it is no mystery. They say the monastery still prays. The wind is its abbot, the stones its choir. Dr. Jacobian, in his final report, wrote, "Architecture was never mute to them. They believed sound could survive stone, that the world itself listens. What they built was not a church, but an instrument through which creation might answer." Standing there at dusk, the ruins seem almost alive, basalt walls glowing faintly in amber light, the air trembling with a note too deep to name. Perhaps it is only the wind. Or perhaps, as the old manuscript says, the bells still ring for those who listen not with the ear, but with the heart. Beneath the oldest quarter of Rome, under the labyrinthine galleries of the Catacomb of Priscilla, there lies a chamber unlike the rest, a room sealed by brick, forgotten for more than a millennium. It was rediscovered in 1989 during a cautious restoration led by the Pontifical Commission for Sacred Archaeology, when workers widening a maintenance tunnel struck what appeared to be a hollow wall. Behind it, they found a crypt preserved in silence, its air thick with the scent of dust and lime, as if the centuries had never moved. Inside was nothing at first glance. No bones, no coffins, no relics. Only a smooth circular slab of obsidian set into the far wall, polished to a mirror's sheen. Around it, faint frescoes in red and gold, angels without faces, lamps without flames, and below, a line of faded Greek. To look within the light is to see what endures. In 1923, a French archaeologist named Camille Derrier documented a fragment of that same hymn carved on a limestone tablet found near Wadi Nat Run. The carving was incomplete, but the first line translated to, "Light speaks through the silence of those who listen." Derrier wrote that he had felt an unexplainable warmth while tracing the letters, as if the stone retained the memory of breath. The archaeologists named it the Chamber of the Mirror. Early radiocarbon analysis of the pigments placed the paintings in the late 3rd century CE, the period of persecution under Emperor Diocletian, when Christians buried their dead and their faith beneath the earth. The obsidian disc, however, was older volcanic glass from Lipari, possibly of Etruscan origin. How it came to be sealed within a Christian tomb remains an unanswered question. At first, the team assumed it was decorative. But when conservator Lucia Ferrante cleaned the surface under lamplight, she noticed something strange. The reflection was too deep. The mirror absorbed light instead of returning it. When a candle was placed before it, the flame seemed to fold inward, vanishing into an infinite tunnel of darkness. Later imaging with laser scanning revealed microscopic scratches forming concentric spirals on the obsidian surface. Not random, but deliberate. When plotted, they mirrored the geometric patterns found in early Christian mosaics representing the Ouroboros, the serpent that devours its own tail, symbol of eternity. Dr. Alessandro Valli, a historian of early Christian symbology, suggested that the mirror might have been used in ritual contemplation, not as vanity, but as vision. Ancient texts describe speculum meditationis, the mirror of prayer, used by ascetics to focus their thoughts on the inner light. In some apocryphal writings of the 2nd century, attributed to Clement of Rome, there is mention of the dark mirror through which the spirit shows his own image. In 1991, infrared photography captured faint handprints around the stone, 5 in total, arranged in a circle, as if marking the act of invocation. Analysis showed traces of oil and cinnabar, both substances used in early ritual anointing. Among the fragments on the chamber floor, archaeologists found a small lead cylinder sealed with wax. Inside, a parchment fragment survived, its writing faint but legible. Not every light is seen by eyes. Some are reflected only by silence. The script matched late antique cursive from the 4th century. It might have been left by one of the early monastic groups known as the spirituals, who practiced nocturnal prayer in underground sanctuaries. Further study revealed that the chamber's acoustics were extraordinary. When sound was made, even a whisper, it produced a resonance that lingered several seconds longer than in the surrounding catacombs. Engineers attributed it to the concave wall opposite the obsidian disc, which amplified low frequencies. To the ancient monks, this echo may have been more than physics. It was the voice of the unseen answering back. Ferrante wrote in her notes, "It feels as though the room listens." The idea haunted him. He returned twice more, searching the desert monasteries for remnants of that chant. The monks of Deir al-Baramus spoke vaguely of it, a forbidden melody that could only be heard once and never repeated aloud. They said it was a hymn that changed the listener more than the world around them. When the Vatican team resealed the chamber for conservation, they left the mirror undisturbed. But not before conducting one final experiment. A beam of narrow light was projected onto the disc to record its reflective properties. The result startled them. Instead of diffusing, the beam refracted back in a faint spiral, a reflection pattern identical to the carved scratches on its surface. It was as if the stone remembered its own geometry. Geologists later confirmed that the obsidian contained a rare inclusion pattern, bands of magnetite aligned in a helical formation, possibly formed under intense volcanic pressure. The pattern's interaction with light could produce polarized reflections, creating the illusion of depth. Yet among the team, few accepted that explanation fully. Something about the mirror defied ordinary description. In medieval accounts, there are brief mentions of mirrors of black glass used by early anchorites near Rome. A 10th century codex in the Bibliotheca Casanatense refers to the monks of the shadowed glass, who practiced illumination through darkness. No verifiable link connects them to the catacombs, but the resonance of imagery is unmistakable. Today, the chamber is sealed once more, its entrance marked by a discrete stone plate engraved simply with speculum silentiae, the mirror of silence. Only a handful of researchers have stood before it. Those who have described an overwhelming stillness, as if the air grows heavier the longer one stays. Some claim to hear a low hum, though no equipment has recorded it. Ferrante, in a later interview, said softly, "It's not frightening, it's peaceful. It's like standing at the edge of thought, listening to something older than prayer." The Vatican has released few official statements, citing conservation protocols. Yet privately, scholars continue to debate whether the mirror was a remnant of Gnostic mysticism, an early Christian tool for meditation, or simply a symbol of resurrection, darkness holding light within. In 2020, new imaging performed with hyperspectral cameras detected faint pigment traces forming a halo around the mirror's rim, a motif of intertwining vines and stars. It may have once depicted the Garden of Paradise, rendered not in color but in reflection. The chamber remains a paradox, Christian in iconography, pagan in material, and scientific in construction. Standing there, amid the scent of dust and ancient lime, one might imagine the solitary monk who lit his lamp and gazed into that black surface. What did he see? His own reflection, or the flicker of the divine echoing back? The historian in him sought evidence, but the silence offered none. Only faint impressions of circles carved on door lintels, concentric rings fading outward, like ripples on water. Perhaps it was never meant to be seen by the eyes at all. Perhaps it was a door disguised as glass, not to another place, but to the silence within. And as the workers sealed the entrance once more, Ferrante wrote a final line in her notebook. "The mirror does not reflect us. It remembers us." In the spring of 2016, on the edge of an olive grove near the ancient city of Hierapolis in western Turkey, a team of Italian and Turkish archaeologists uncovered the ruins of a small Byzantine hermitage. The excavation, part of the Frontiers of Faith survey led by the University of Salento, had been focused on early monastic settlements along the Lycus Valley, places where solitude once thrived in stone. But what they found that year was not another cell or cistern. It was a chapel whose walls were alive with wings. The frescoes that covered the apse showed hundreds of birds, cranes, doves, and swallows, flying not upward toward heaven, but inward toward a single radiant point. Beneath them, a faint Greek inscription read, "Their song is prayer, their flight, remembrance." The discovery soon became known among the team as the Chapel of the Birds. At first, it was thought to be decorative, an innocent symbol of the Holy Spirit. But the more they cleaned, the stranger it became. The painter had rendered each bird with astonishing precision. Accurate species from Anatolia, even migratory ones like the hoopoe and the ibis. One fresco showed a monk seated beneath a cypress, his hand raised as though in benediction, and around him, a spiral of birds painted with gold dust, as if circling in eternal motion. In the mosaic floor, tesserae of turquoise and limestone formed a pattern of feathers. When viewed from above, the arrangement resembled a vortex, a spiral that drew the eye toward the altar, where a hollow bronze vessel lay buried. When lifted, it was found to be shaped like a bird in mid-flight. Inside, a thin layer of dust glittered faintly under light. Laboratory analysis later confirmed it was a mix of burnt incense and powdered mica, a substance once used to reflect light like wings in motion. Beneath the vessel, a parchment sealed in beeswax bore an inscription in Greek minuscule. "This is the hymn of creation, where each wing knows the word." There are accounts of other archaeologists who later claimed to have heard faint humming when walking through the catacombs of Qam el-Shokafa. The frequencies recorded on tape were too low to identify, resting below the threshold of human hearing. Some believed it was the resonance of the earth itself. Others said it was nothing but imagination, the mind reaching backward toward meaning. The document, though fragmentary, described a group of monks who called themselves hoi orniophoroi, the bearers of birds. They believed that birds carried prayers to the divine through song, and that their flight mirrored the soul's return to its source. Historical parallels soon surfaced. In a 9th century text known as the Life of Saint Theophanes the Hermit, there is mention of a sect near Hierapolis who kept vigil with the dawn song of the birds, claiming to read the scripture of the sky. These hermits considered sound itself sacred, not written word, but the resonance of living breath. Dr. Eleni Cortisi, the lead archaeologist, noticed something else. The chapel's orientation was unusual. Instead of facing east, it was tilted 10 degrees north, aligned perfectly with the migratory route of the cranes that cross Anatolia each spring. It was, she said, a chapel built in dialogue with the wind. Acoustic testing confirmed that the dome possessed remarkable resonance. When one sang beneath it, the echo mimicked the rhythm of wings, a fluttering tremor that seemed to move through the air. In the lower chamber, the team discovered fragments of terracotta flutes shaped like beaks. Similar instruments, known as aulos ornis, were once used in ancient Greek rituals to imitate birdsong. The monks, it seemed, had inherited this older practice, baptizing it into a new theology. Among the recovered objects was a small marble plaque with an inscription in Syriac. "The Spirit speaks not only in fire, but in feathers." Such words bridged two worlds, the language of monastic Christianity and the echo of pre-Christian nature cults. It was not heresy, but reverence in another form. When the frescoes were restored, traces of microscopic gold leaf were found on the birds' wings, so thin that they shimmered when the oil lamps flickered. Under the flickering light, the birds would have appeared to move, to breathe, to fly. One evening, as the team finished their work, a flock of starlings crossed the sky above the excavation, swirling in a murmuration like smoke over the hills. For a moment, the archaeologists stood in silence. It was as if the fresco had taken flight again. And yet, when those same recordings were played years later in a laboratory, an unexpected pattern emerged in the static. A pulse of rhythm that matched the tempo of human breath. Dr. Cortese wrote in her field diary, "I think they painted what they saw every dawn, a gospel without words, a scripture that sings." Later, scholars linked the imagery to the teachings of Saint Basil and the Cappadocian Fathers, who described creation itself as a hymn of praise. Basil's Hexameron speaks of the winged creatures whose song is worship, whose flight is a psalm. The chapel of the birds seemed to embody that theology in stone. Radiocarbon dating placed the paintings in the early 10th century, during the reign of Leo VI, a period of renewed monastic mysticism. The pigments, lapis from Afghanistan, ochre from Cappadocia, malachite from the Pontic coast, suggested a workshop of considerable wealth. But who funded such a remote hermitage remains a mystery. In 2019, the bronze vessel was analyzed using mass spectrometry. Residue within it contained traces of honey and rose oil, substances used in Byzantine liturgy, but also in ancient funerary rites. The dual symbolism, offering and memory, hinted that the chapel served not only as a place of prayer, but as a memorial to those who sought union with the divine through sound. A local legend, recorded in a 19th century travel diary by the French archaeologist Charles Texier, tells of shepherds hearing songs without singers near the ruins of Hierapolis at dawn, tones rising from the ground when the mist was thick. Modern science attributes such phenomena to the resonance of wind through buried cavities. But the legend persisted, and the discovery of the chapel gave it new voice. Today, the Chapel of the Birds remains closed to the public, its frescoes too fragile for exposure. Yet those who have entered describe an uncanny calm, a stillness so complete that one begins to hear one's own breath as music. Standing within its hollow dome, a whisper becomes an echo becomes a flutter, and suddenly the silence feels alive, as if the ancient prayers are still circling above, invisible but near. Perhaps that was their purpose all along, to remind those who listened that divinity was never distant. It moved through air and song, through every beating wing, through every pause between notes. And when the lamps go out, and the night settles over the Lycus Valley, one can almost imagine the birds returning, not painted nor flesh but luminous. The hymns of the forgotten monks made visible again, flying toward a light beyond sound. The stars are older than memory, yet they have never learned to rush. Perhaps that was coincidence, or perhaps the song was still there, lingering between the molecules of stone, the memory of 1,000 exhales woven into dust. Somewhere beyond the last horizon of thought, every story we have told, the scrolls, the mirrors, the bells, the ashes, dissolves into one slow breath. History does not end. It exhales. From the sands of Qumran to the flooded ports of Caesarea, from the fire-darkened library at Sinai to the whispering towers of Armenia, each fragment we have unearthed belongs to the same silence, the silence that watches the world remember itself. The archaeologists write of pigment and carbon, of strata and dating, but beneath every note there is something softer. A pulse, a rhythm, the steady heartbeat of what refuses to be forgotten. For centuries, humanity has buried its questions beneath stone, only to dig them up again when sleep returns. The lost gospels, the burnt hymns, the mirrors that swallowed light, all are the same gesture repeated across time. The desire to listen for what once spoke, even if no one remembers the words. Perhaps all civilizations dream alike. The Atlanteans, the monks of Sinai, the masons of Zeraean, the nameless hermits of Hierapolis, each, in their own tongue, sought to trace the outline of the unseen. And maybe that is what endures. Not the temples, not the scripts, but the act of reaching, the quiet motion toward the divine. Tonight, as you close your eyes, imagine the dust settling across those forgotten rooms. The ash of a burned manuscript drifting like snow, the wind moving through hollow bronze, the reflection of a candle sinking into black glass. Every ruin holds its own heartbeat, waiting for someone to listen. The ocean still murmurs over drowned cities. The mountains still echo when the wind touches their stones. And beneath them all, In the dark chambers of the world, the old words breathe. In the faint light of a candle, the image of that lost ritual begins to breathe again. A circle of figures cloaked in linen, their faces calm, eyes half closed, palms open to the air. No words are spoken, only the sound of inhalation and release. A single lamp burns at the center, flame reflected in bronze mirrors arranged around it. The glow touches their faces like dawn. Each breath enters the silence, carrying something invisible, grief, hope, memory, and each exhale returns it purified. What survives of us is not our certainty, but our wonder. And perhaps, somewhere in that wonder, the divine continues, not as thunder, but as sleep, not as revelation, but as the soft remembering of light. So rest now, traveler of lost times. Let the world fade into the hush between stars. The story continues beneath your breathing, a long archaeology of dreams, where even silence remembers its name. No one leads, no one follows. The song is the air itself. Above them, the city of Alexandria sleeps, unaware that beneath its marble streets, the oldest hymn of all continues, not sung, but remembered. When the archaeologist who rediscovered the site left the catacombs that night, he wrote in his journal that the silence followed him out. He could still feel the hum of something gentle under his ribs, long after the sea wind had filled the tunnels again. He never published his findings, only a single line at the bottom of his report. The sound of light cannot be studied, only felt. And perhaps that is true. For even now, if one stands quietly in those ruins, where salt, oil, and breath have mingled through centuries, and lets the noise of the world fall away, there comes a moment when the body remembers the ancient rhythm. The inhale that carries you inward, the exhale that lets you go. The same rhythm that moves the tides, that draws the stars across the dark. Perhaps it is not the hymn that remains, but the memory it awakens. That we, too, are fragments of a forgotten light, waiting to hum ourselves back into being. The air in the catacombs holds its warmth a little longer before surrendering to the cold. A single grain of dust floats through the beam of a flashlight, glowing as it turns. The archaeologist pauses, unsure whether it was stirred by his own movement or by something unseen. The lamp's flame bends, then steadies. The hymn has not been sung for centuries. And yet, if one listens not with the ear, but with the space behind the breath, it is still there, soft, patient, unending. A song made of silence, and the silence made of light. There are nights in the hills of Galilee when the air stands so still that even the stars seem to listen. The olive trees barely move. The scent of dust and sap lingers like a slow prayer. Somewhere near Mount Arbel, between the caves that overlook the silent Sea of Galilee, an archaeologist kneels beneath the light of a flickering torch. In his hands, he holds a fragment of parchment so delicate it quivers with his breathing. The words are faint, the ink almost erased, yet it carries a rhythm that feels alive. It is written in a simple script, Aramaic of the 1st century. The first line reads, "He taught them not with speech, but with silence, for silence is the mother of the word." The second line trails off, ending mid-thought, as if the scribe himself had exhaled and never returned. For years, scholars debated whether the fragment belonged to the known Apocrypha or to something older, an oral tradition predating any written gospel. They call it the Gospel of the Breath. Its authenticity is uncertain, its meaning impossible to contain. Yet the tone of the text, the intimacy of it, feels unmistakably close to the voice that once spoke along these same shores. The cave where it was found opens toward the east, facing dawn. It is small, almost hidden by vines. Inside, the walls are lined with scratches, not of animals, but of hands marking symbols in dust and soot. Spirals, circles, small waves. Some archaeologists call them primitive graffiti. Others believe they were diagrams of breath, visual prayers drawn in the air and fixed to stone. One of the carvings bears 3 faint letters, ruach, the ancient Hebrew word for spirit, wind, and breath, all the same. The word that once described the first movement of creation, the invisible current that hovered over the waters before the world began. The discovery stirred quiet wonder among the few who studied it. Here, beneath a sky that had watched over prophets and fishermen, someone long ago had tried to describe divinity not in sermons or miracles, but in the simple act of breathing. There is a story, unrecorded and proven, but passed from monk to monk in the monasteries of the Judean desert, that Jesus once taught a lesson without speaking. His disciples, weary from travel, gathered around him beneath an olive tree. Instead of words, he simply breathed, long, slow, deliberate, until the wind itself seemed to imitate him. They waited for a parable, a command, but none came, only the sound of his breath and the whisper of the leaves. And in that moment, they understood something that no scripture could hold. That life and spirit are one movement, the same pulse shared by heaven and earth. Perhaps it was only legend, or perhaps that silent teaching left its trace in the hidden gospel now unfolding from dust. The parchment, examined under magnification, reveals tiny dots between the lines, not decorative but rhythmic, like notation, as though the text was meant to be read with breath, not voice. When recited in that measured rhythm, the words take on a strange calm. The archaeologist who first read them aloud described feeling his heartbeat slow, his vision soften. It was, he wrote, as if the air in the cave grew thicker, aware of its own listening. He later found that the pattern of breath embedded in the phrases matched the cadence used in ancient Essene meditative practice. 4 beats in, for beats held, for released, for in stillness. The same pattern found centuries later in monastic breathing rituals and in Eastern spiritual traditions. How such symmetry survived across continents and millennia remains unexplainable, unless the rhythm itself is older than belief. The text speaks gently. The soul does not pray with words but with air. When the breath is pure, heaven remembers. There are no commandments, no miracles, no names. Only reminders, quiet invitations to return inward, to listen where sound ends, to find in one's own pulse the echo of creation. The fragment's last readable line is almost invisible. He who holds his breath in peace knows the name that was never spoken, and then nothing. When the archaeologist left the cave that evening, he stood at its mouth and watched the sea shimmer beneath the fading sun. The horizon breathed in rhythm, water drawing back, then returning. The air was still, and yet everything moved. He wrote later that he felt as if the entire landscape inhaled with him. The reeds, the birds, the stones themselves, as though the world were one great lung exhaling eternity. He named the find the gospel of the breath, not as a claim but as a gesture. He believed it was less a gospel than an instruction on how to listen, how to hear the divine in the pauses between words. Centuries before, the desert fathers spoke of hesychia, the sacred stillness, the prayer of the heart. They said that true communion was not speech but rhythm, the alignment of one's breath with the breath of God. Perhaps what was once whispered in this cave was the same teaching, long before the word church had shape or the cross had meaning. In the archives of Jerusalem, there exists a note written in the archaeologist's hand before his death. It says simply, "When I read the fragment aloud, I felt it reading me back. It knew the shape of my silence. That silence now fills the cave again." The parchment rests beneath glass in a climate-controlled room, its edges slowly dissolving, the ink fading as if returning to air. And yet the idea that the sacred may dwell not in thunder or scripture but in the invisible act of breathing lingers like a soft light between ages. Sometimes, when scholars visit the cave at dawn, they report a peculiar sensation. A warmth at the entrance, though the air is cool. A feeling of presence without form. Some describe hearing the faint sound of wind moving in circles, though there is none. Others say the silence feels so full it becomes a kind of sound itself. If you were to stand there, among the stones and the scent of wild thyme, and close your eyes, you might feel it too. The pulse beneath your ribs, the rise and fall that has never once ceased since the first light touched the waters. And if you listen long enough, you may understand why the scribe wrote no conclusion, why the parchment ends midline. Because breath itself is the ending and the beginning. Because to inhale is to receive the world, and to exhale is to return it unchanged. Perhaps that is what they meant when they wrote. He taught them not with speech, but with silence. The cave remains quiet, open to the east, waiting for another dawn. The sea still breathes, the dust still holds memory, and somewhere in the hush between one heartbeat and the next, the gospel continues, unwritten, unseen, alive in the breath of those who remember to listen. In the foothills of Provence, not far from the town of Saint-Maximin-la-Saint-Baume, the air carries a fragrance unlike any other: cedar, myrrh, and limestone dust, mingled with the faint coolness of caves. Here, in the shadows of the Saint-Baume Mountains, legend says that Mary Magdalene lived out her final years in seclusion, praying in silence within a cave that opens toward the dawn. Pilgrims have walked the steep trail for centuries, climbing through oak and beech forest to reach that high, hollow place the locals still call La Grotte de la Saint-Baume. They say she wept there, not for sin but for memory, for the world that had forgotten what she once knew. The chapter begins one late afternoon in that same cave. A small team of archaeologists from Aix-en-Provence, led by Dr. Camille Rousseau, kneels near a side chamber long sealed by a layer of calcified soil. The cave's temperature never changes, a constant 13 degrees, preserving everything left within. Their lanterns flicker over walls streaked with soot from medieval candles. From the ceiling hangs a rosary of mineral droplets that catch the light like frozen breath. They are searching for remnants of early Christian occupation, pottery shards, oil lamps, inscriptions. But what they find is stranger. A fragment of polished metal, oval-shaped, covered with centuries of tarnish. Rousseau cleans it gently with a cloth soaked in distilled water, and as the layers lift, the surface begins to reveal the faint outline of a face. Not painted, but reflected. A mirror. Its frame, tested later, is bronze from the 1st century CE, alloyed with traces of tin and silver, the kind used in Judea during the early Roman period. It should not be here. When the mirror is placed upright, it captures the soft light of the lanterns, scattering it across the damp stone. The archaeologists grow silent, watching how the reflection dances over the cave walls. Rousseau writes in her field journal that she felt a presence in the air, not spectral, but human, like the echo of breath still suspended. The artifact bears a faint engraving along its edge, a Greek word barely visible beneath oxidation. Mneme, memory. Historians have long debated the figure of Magdalene. In the canonical Gospels, she appears only in fragments. The woman who watched from the cross, who found the empty tomb, who spoke first to the risen one. Later centuries reshaped her into many forms: penitent sinner, mystic, saint, myth. But earlier, in texts buried and banned, another Magdalene appeared, not fallen but knowing. In the Gospel of Mary, discovered at Akhmim in Egypt and later at Nag Hammadi, she speaks with clarity and sorrow, describing visions of the soul ascending through light. Her teaching begins with one command: do not weep, for grace will guide you through all. Could this mirror have belonged to one who carried such knowledge north, across the sea, when the early followers fled persecution? Roman records note an exodus from Judea after 70 CE, families, traders, and believers dispersing across the Mediterranean. In the oral traditions of Provence, Magdalene arrived by boat at the port of Les Saintes Maries de la Mer, carrying with her a small vessel of oil, a gospel of light, and a mirror of bronze. The mirror, according to those stories, was her companion in solitude, not for vanity, but for remembrance. She would gaze not to see her face, but to watch how light changed upon it, believing each shimmer was a sign of the divine still breathing through her. To know the soul, the later mystics wrote, one must see not the reflection, but the light that rests upon it. When the French archaeologists send the artifact for spectral analysis, microscopic traces of scented resin are found, myrrh and nard, substances used in Jewish and Egyptian anointing rituals. Around the rim, particles of linen fiber remain, likely from the cloths used to polish sacred instruments. Rousseau notes that these materials align with the funerary rites practiced in Galilee and the Levant in the early 1st century. But what truly unsettles the team is what they find beneath the mirror. When lifted from the ground, It leaves behind a faint circular stain, mineralized over centuries, shaped like a face pressed softly into the stone. Not carved, not drawn, just the ghost of a human outline, as if someone had knelt there for years, their forehead resting where the mirror once lay. The discovery sparks quiet speculation. Perhaps it was the meditation site of an early hermit, a follower of the Magdalene cult that flourished in southern France during the 4th and 5th centuries. Perhaps it was a later pilgrim who brought a relic from the Holy Land. Or perhaps, though no historian would claim it aloud, the object had remained there since she herself sought silence among these cliffs. In medieval manuscripts, such as La Legende Dorée and the Chronicles of Jacobus de Voragine, Magdalene is said to have prayed in solitude, lifted daily by angels to hear celestial music. The cave was described as glowing with a light that knew no fire. Pilgrims in the 13th century reported visions of a woman clothed in dawn, appearing where the walls shone brightest. Modern science finds no miracles there, only the reflection of torchlight upon salt crystals embedded in the limestone. Yet even knowing that, one cannot stand inside the Saint Baume without sensing a peculiar warmth in the air, as though the cave breathes.